Okay, we should be live, but I'm waiting to hear from Jerry.
Okay, it's a big blue square in here. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay,
Oh,
I don't know
no.
what. Okay.
I don't know why that's happening. Oh, there we go. Cool.
Uh,
Okay. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our Facebook Live Q&A session regarding the 2020 elections. My name is Merritt Beria, and I'm an organizer for Mississippi Democratic Voter Protection. Here with me today, I also have Latoya Thompson, the state director for the Mississippi Democratic Party Voter Protection Program, House Minority Leader, Representative Robert Johnson, and member of the House Elections Committee, Representative Zakiya Summers. And I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves a little further, and I'll let Director Thompson tell you a little more about our program as well.
Hello, I am Latoya Thompson. I grew up in Rankin County, so I'm a native and proud Mississippian. Went to law school at Ole Miss Law School, and after clerking for several years and teaching in the law school, I have been offered the great opportunity this year to serve as the Mississippi Democratic Party Voter Protection Director. And our program through the Mississippi Democratic Party is a collaboration between the party and Stacey Abrams' Fair Fight 2020. We are one of 18 states that Fair Fight has sought to support this type of programming in, and we are very excited because this program allows us to have a much longer term voter protection program than the typical 1 or 2 months ahead of time. So we get to do fun and very meaningful things like work with Representative Summers and Leader Johnson on legislative advocacy and voter education, outreach, and intervention. We are a staff of 3, Merritt, Jarius Adams, and myself. And right now we have about 100 volunteers, and we're looking to have about 400 volunteers going into Election Day. So that's a little bit about the State Party Voter Protection Program.
Representative Summers?
All right, good evening. Happy Friday to everyone. I am Zakiya Summers, and I represent House District 68, which covers Hinds County and a portion of Rankin County. This is my first term. I am a former election commissioner for Hinds County. I served there for almost a full term before I ran for this position. And before getting into being a public servant, I worked at the ACLU of Mississippi as a director of communications and advocacy, where one of our issue areas was voting rights. And so I'm a forever advocate of voting rights and ensuring that people have access to the ballot box.
Good evening. I want to thank everybody for being here. I'm Robert Johnson, Minority Leader in the House of Representatives. I've served in the Senate, and now I'm in the House. Altogether in the legislature, I've been there over 26 years. I'm a lawyer by profession. I've been practicing law for close to 30 years. And from Natchez, Mississippi, born and raised. I represent the area in Southwest Mississippi composed of Adams, Franklin, and Jefferson counties. That's District 94. And so it's good to be here. This is going to be a very it doesn't have to be complicated, but it could be a complex time in terms of elections, and we want to make sure that we do all we can to make it simple for the people we represent. We're glad to have the Democratic Party and the work they're about to do. It's going to be really important in helping us craft legislation and whatever we have to put in place during this pandemic.
Great. Well, with those introductions, I think that we can go ahead and just dive right in. Director Thompson, do you want to take the question of why Mississippi voter protection is absolutely critical this year in particular? I mean, obviously voter protection is critical all years, but we're facing some special circumstances this year that really necessitate beefed up voter protection programs.
Absolutely. At least two reasons, and I encourage our representatives to chime in as well. But number one, this is a presidential year, and we have a lot of issues that need to be handled a little differently. People need a little bit more help and a little bit more attention, particularly in Mississippi. And in a presidential year, in terms of voter protection type things, we look at statistics, we look at turnout, and so we know turnout is highest in presidential years. And in our last few presidential elections, we've had between 1.2 and 1.3 million voters to vote. And the data that we have shows that we expect 1.41 million voters, so even more voters this year. Now, we don't know how COVID will affect that, but we expect a lot of people to cast a vote in November. And what makes it really tricky this year is the COVID-19 virus and how we can allow people to vote safely. So that's definitely what we want to talk about during this time.
Absolutely. And, given that we're clearly facing this huge election in November, what can Mississippi do to make voting safer? And before we kind of get into that, I want to provide a little overview of kind of what elections look like currently in Mississippi. So Mississippi is one of 17 states that require excuse-only absentee voting. For those of you who don't know what that means in order to vote absentee or by mail early or in person, you have to meet a certain requirement, such as being a student that's out of town, or a deployed military personnel, or some other reason that theoretically prevents you from being there in person on Election Day. And according to a recent Mississippi Today article, Mississippi is one of 6 states in the United States of America that has not taken any steps to ensure that our elections are safer in November. And several states that were excuse-only absentee voting prior to 2020, like Mississippi, have taken steps to change this in light of COVID-19. For example, the Alabama Secretary of State is on record saying that voters who don't want to vote in person over concerns about the virus can actually check the box that says they have a physical illness or infirmity which prevents their attendance at the polls. And in addition, other states that have similar laws to Mississippi, states like Tennessee, Texas, and South Carolina, litigation has been filed to either change the state's voting procedures to no excuse absentee voting entirely, or to at least allow COVID-19 to serve as a legitimate excuse. So with that being said, what has Mississippi done in recent history by way of changing election law? And kind of how do we see that factoring into what could happen this year?
So I'm going to defer to Representative Summers, since she's our resident expert on these issues. But one of the things I'd like to, Meredith's right. We have to make steps to make it safer. We also needed to make it more convenient, and so that'll require some mail-in voting. We also need to make it safer and sanitary at polling places, and we don't have any of those things in place. If you have mail-in voting, and Representative Summers can tell me if I'm right about this, if we change the rules about how we do absentee and not make it just excuse only, we're going to have a surge in mail-in ballots. I don't know if we have a system in place that can handle that many mail-in ballots. So we have to figure out what that system will be. But those are the kind of things that we have to look at going down the line. But Representative Summers, who dealt with this a lot as election commissioner, can tell us more about that.
Yeah. Thank you, Representative Johnson. So in terms of what we've seen over the last few years, I think one of the biggest reforms that we've seen that actually perpetuates voter suppression is voter ID. Once the Shelby decision was made, we saw secretaries of state across the country, particularly in Republican-run states, do a fast track of putting voter ID in place. Following voter ID, which was in 2014, our Secretary of State at that time, who is now our Lieutenant Governor, decided to compose a task force of individuals to begin to engage on how they could expand access through election reform. And through many meetings and convenings, they were able to produce a report that really put together a a healthy election reform bill that included everything from online voter registration to early voting to some campaign finance rules and et cetera. And at that time, Secretary Holzman, Lieutenant Governor Holzman, felt that Mississippi was moving in the right direction in terms of implementing those reforms. Those reforms were introduced in the House and had no issue with getting through the process in the House, but would always stall in the Senate and would die in the Senate. And unfortunately, our now governor, who was lieutenant governor at the time, was not interested in doing any type of election reform, and therefore those bills would die. Now, we've seen some technical changes over the last couple of years in regards to increased pay for election commissioners, moving the voter registration deadline. For instance, if it falls on a Saturday, registration forms will be received by that following Monday. We've also seen a move to add an additional disenfranchising crime, which is voter fraud. So a couple of years ago in the Senate, voter fraud was added to the list of disenfranchising crimes, which means that if you are convicted of one of these now 23 disenfranchising crimes, you lose your voting rights for life. And so it's been interesting to see how the argument has been around the need to not want to expand access in a way that we think Representative Johnson would be convenient, safe, secure, and accessible for most Mississippi voters, and instead perpetuate this idea that if we do some of these measures like vote by mail, like no excuse absentee voting, then we're actually perpetuating voter fraud, which we've seen that has actually been minuscule across the country. There are, I believe, 37 states that have online voter registration, that have early voting, and we've seen other states, even our neighbors like Georgia and others, that have automatically sent applications to voters as a way to make sure that people do not have to decide between their safety and their health in order to participate in democracy.
Excellent.
Absolutely.
The interesting dynamic that you brought up is about the now current governor and the dynamic that we're going to deal with the current lieutenant governor, who's a former Secretary of State. I would anticipate some of the changes that I think you would advocate in terms of mail-in voting, making it less rigorous for a person to come to the polls or register to vote. Online. We don't even do. We need to have more open online registration. We don't do online registration.
We don't have online voter registration at all. What we have is a system where you can go in and update your status, and that came out of that task force that Lieutenant Governor Holzman was leading. But we do not. We still have an antiquated paper-based voter registration system.
Yeah, see, that makes no sense. And the current governor, I can anticipate him. We could pass these bills out of the House and the Senate, and if he is going to be consistent in his diatribe that he engages in now, whatever the president says, he repeats. The president, any state, any way he can, he's against mail-in voting, he's against online registration. I would anticipate that's a fight we're going to have with our governor. So I'm glad you brought that up. That's the dynamic we're going to have.
Right.
Absolutely.
And as Representative Summers mentioned, there was a 2014 election task force. There was a 2016 election reform panel, bipartisan group. I believe it was about 37 people, attorneys, representatives, various folks. And the 2014 group and the 2016 group both said, let's do online registration. And both groups said, let's do in-person early voting. I think they both even said for a period of 21 days. But they both seem to come to an agreement on that. But, when it gets to the legislature, it's a problem. And so even with House Bill 809, which was passed in 2016, which said people could update their registration online, I mean, why is that okay? You can update your registration online, and part of the bill was that you had to set up a secure network and system to do it. So why is that okay for updating, but we can't get online voter registration through?
Yeah, you're right. That makes no sense.
That doesn't
And
make sense.
and
Yeah.
to our current Secretary of State's credit, which he and I have bumped heads on Twitter at least about some of the things that he's been proposing. He actually
Yeah.
is in support of online voter registration, but he is absolutely not in support of vote by mail, which is asinine to me. You know, we know that the president has voted by mail and it works. We know that Mississippi already offers vote by mail for our military voters and it works. We already know that Mississippi offers absentee voting for permanent voters who are disabled, are taking care of a disabled person, or are 65 years or older, and it works. And so, if all of those avenues work for mail in voting, then there really isn't an argument to say that it can't work for the rest of Mississippi.
The implication is that fraud only exists in certain populations.
Yeah, yeah. That they only want mail in. That demographic that Representative Summers just described, military, 65 and older, all those people, they presume them to be in Mississippi. They would presume them to be Republicans, and so that would be okay with them. But we want to open it up to everybody, and I think the current lieutenant governor would think the same thing. And if you're not going to have mail-in voting, you at least ought to have early voting. Well, especially in this pandemic, where people can pick days and it won't be everybody bunched up in one place at one time. So I mean I think the sentiment in both houses this year would be to have at least early voting and maybe some form of mail-in voting. The problem is going to be when it gets to the governor. So
Right.
we have to be prepared for that. And this new coalition, we all getting along, kumbaya kind of a thing that we have going on. We hope that we can that'll transcend this giving out money, and it'll lend itself to adopting some policy that will be good for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you bring that up, Representative Johnson, because our next question on the agenda is what does the legislative agenda look like? I know you guys go back in session next week. And so as far as elections, what is that going to look like? How do you think that's going to shake out in reality in the 2020 session?
Well, the conversations I've had with the leadership, they understand that we have to do something about elections given our current condition that we find ourselves in around the country. The question is, what do we do? It is helpful that at least the current Secretary of State is at least, and he's a conservative, at least he's thinking about online registration. So that's a start. So I think we're going to get to, I think it'll be very difficult to sit in a room and talk about how do we make elections safer and not talk about early voting, a more expanded early voting, and some form of mail-in voting. And so I think all of that is on the table, and I feel confident we'll get some parts of both of those things. And Representative Summers is going to be our lead out of the Democratic caucus on those issues. And it will probably not be the first thing we deal with when we come back. We still have health issues to deal with the stimulus money. We have education, which we have to get ready for the fall. And we have a serious problem with corrections that we have to deal with in terms of how we're going to spend some of this money to make sure we get testing done. But right there on that agenda would be elections. So that's what I anticipate we'll do, in pretty much in that order when we get back.
Yeah. So I've had a conversation with the chairman in the House, and he's planning to have a joint meeting with the Senate on Thursday when we get back. I don't know the time and I don't know the room, but he's been in conversations, of course, with Senator Branning and Senator Blunt, who are chair and vice chair on the Senate side. I've had conversations with Senator Blunt as well. He and I are of course on the same page about some of the things that we need to be putting in place to expand voting and make sure that it's accessible for everyone. I've spoken with the chair about those things. He definitely hasn't provided any pushback. He's been open to hearing what I have to say. And we're hoping that the Secretary of State, or at least his representative, will be there in the meeting so that we can get a clear understanding of what it is they're hoping to do, and also, how they intend on spending this money. Because they've gotten millions of dollars outside of what the state of Mississippi has gotten through the CARES Act funding. And he's mentioned in some of his op-eds, et cetera, about increasing election security. And so I'm interested to know, what does that mean? How does he intend on using the National Guard as part of this system? And it can't just be, of course, this is important, but it can't just be providing PPE on election day. It's got to be something more than that.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, what's the point? Why do we need the National Guard to provide face masks and gloves and sanitation? Why a show of force to open up an election?
Right. And
That's
I'm so glad you brought that up. And we watched that exchange between you, Representative Summers, and the Secretary of State. So, there are other ways to do that. The receiving manager at the poll, who's responsible for picking up the ballot boxes and taking the ballot boxes back, why would you not drop off the sanitizer and drop off the masks with the ballot boxes, so that somebody already has to go pick those up and take them to the poll? Why would you not let somebody who already has to do that? This is reminiscent for us, our three staff at least, of the actions that caused the Republican National Committee to be under a consent decree in the early 80s, because they were doing things like this, having military presence at polls, and that is intimidating, and particularly targeting precincts where the folks look like us, to make sure somebody's watching you, and I'm watching what you do when you vote. That's intimidating. For almost 40 years, they were under a consent decree to not be able to do that sort of thing. And, for somebody to indicate that they would do that unnecessarily really raises some concerns about sensitivity, about an understanding of our election history, and about, caring for all of your constituents that you represent, and making sure everybody actually feels safe, not just you saying, I'm going to make you feel safe by putting the military there, but actually making people feel safe based on history and based on understanding your own constituents.
Yes.
You hit it right on the nail.
Yeah. What do you all anticipate? What kind of things are you all putting in place, and what would you all like to see us do at the legislature?
So we are, in terms of like the issue that we just named, one of the things that we're going to have on election day is poll watchers. We're trying to have at least 300 precincts in Mississippi. We have about 1776 total, I believe, in our 82 counties. We're trying to have 300 precincts covered, and not just precincts with huge turnout, but we're also trying to target precincts where we really anticipate problems. Some of our rural precincts where we, people might not necessarily think they'll get caught or problems will be reported, but, precincts with a lot of high African American voters, registered voters, and that sort of thing. And so we plan to be there to be on the lookout for what's coming. And we've had instances. I worked on the ESPY campaign, and we did voter protection in 2018. We had instances at a couple of precincts where police officers would park their cars in front of the precinct, and because we had a poll watcher there or a voter who called into our hotline and let us know about that, we were able to call someone and say, hey, excuse me, could you please have this police officer move? We will assume they are well-intentioned, and they perhaps think they are making people feel safe, but not knowing they are doing the opposite for a whole group of people. So we will have poll watchers on the ground. We'll have a boiler room. We'll have a hotline. People can call. They can ask, where am I registered, polling place, etc. So we'll have all that in place by Election Day. We'll be working before Election Day to make sure people know step by step how to vote an absentee ballot. We're getting campus liaisons to make sure lots of young people know how to vote absentee ballot from their school. And those are the kinds of things that we'll be working on. So what we really are hoping to be able to support you all in is getting those legislative changes. At a minimum, we're hoping, as Senator Blunt has stated repeatedly in the news, we can at least get an excuse this year for COVID-19. And not just, as the Secretary of State has said, when the governor or the president declares a state of emergency, because frankly, I mean, look at look at the circumstances now. And we just can't count on, them declaring a state of emergency. I think we really have to look at some language that allows the people to decide, this is a danger to me, and I'm going to use this as an excuse to vote. So, we're hoping to work with you all as that comes up on your agenda to try to get in a good place that actually protects people, where people can actually feel safe voting. And we'll be, as you expand that right, we'll be making sure people are educated about it and that they know under what circumstances they can vote based on what you all were able to get accomplished. And we just hope that that's, the way that we can work together. And we want to continue we want to continue to know what we can do to support you. One of the groups of volunteers that we also have is phone bankers and text bankers. And that's a group of people, so when you get to the point where you're deciding exactly what you want for elections, we can call people and we can go through the voter file and call people and say, hey, please call your legislator. Please ask for an excuse for COVID-19. We need to get this passed.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and that's going to be critical as we move ahead too. And people need to understand that when you do engage with your legislators like that and you contact them advocating for a particular measure, that works. That really works. And so it's so important that, if you don't know who your legislator is, that you first get to know who that person is, but then also make contact with them and let them know how you want them to move ahead, either supporting or opposing a particular piece of legislation. So yeah, that'll be critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And advocacy and volunteer organizing is really a crucial part of what we're trying to do this year. And so for everyone watching, we have a website. It's on our Facebook page, and we also have a Twitter. And so check us out, find out ways to get involved. And I hope you guys can see the interrelation between our program and what the legislature is doing this year, and how important it is that we all let our voices be heard when it comes to holding elections safely.
Right. And Mayor, just to say one more thing, Representative Summers, well, I think they both talked about mail-in voting and the Secretary of State not being a fan of mail-in voting. It's interesting because we were recently informed that he previously was, but now he's not, since Trump has kind of gotten on that bandwagon and explained that expanded options for voting is not good for Republicans. Republicans won't win when that's the case. But one of the additional things we'll be doing to try to back you all up and support you is we'll be doing a voter education campaign about issues like voter fraud. Voter fraud is the big stick that's trying to be used to say why we can't expand mail-in voting. But the Brennan Center, a nonpartisan group, did a report about voter fraud and basically said it's virtually non-existent. They said that most allegations of fraud turn out to be baseless, and most of the few remaining are due to irregularities or something that happened during the election process, not a person trying to misuse or abuse the system. And even a study commissioned by the Trump administration reached the same conclusion. So we will be shouting these sorts of things from the mountaintops, trying to let everybody know there's no real excuse for your legislator to not expand mail-in voting.
Thank you.
Yeah. Folks need to understand that this loudspeaker about voter fraud, don't fall for the okie doke. All that argument is trying to do is to perpetuate mistrust in our democracy, mistrust and misinformation. And then when they lose, they can say, see, I told you it was voter fraud. So, don't fall for the okie doke. The point is, and I want to quote something that the governor said in an article. He said, we must protect our rights as Americans to a free and fair election, but not at the expense of our health and safety of our people. Okay. So if we all agree on that, then we need to do what we need to do to ensure that we have safe, secure, and accessible elections for all Mississippi.
That's exactly right. I believe we quoted him on that in our newsletter. You help me if I'm wrong, Mayor, but I believe we quoted him on that, and we called people to action, and we said, everybody reading this, let's hold them to it.
Yeah, let's. I don't think that's too much to ask.
Right.
Yes. Absolutely. We mentioned the CARES Act money. You mentioned the extra money, Representative Summers, which is $5.6 million. That's not in that big bucket that the governor is trying to spend. And we just wonder what you all think the Secretary of State should do with that money to help elections.
Well, I mean,
money? Mm-hmm.
there are a number of things he could do. I mean, we've talked about him. He's talking about National Guard. I mean, he could hire more. He could put in place more poll watchers that are objective and independent. He could provide for whatever it takes to have PPE equipment there that is just accessible to people. You don't need anybody to hand it out. You could just have enough there that people can get as much of it as they want. And if we're going to do mail-in voting, you're going to have to provide money to election systems around the state to be able to handle that volume. I read something where when they did it in Wisconsin, they went from 6% of the voting. I mean, 6% of the people who voted were mail-in voters to 71%. We wouldn't be able to handle that kind of increase right now. But if you have the money, and there are plenty of people who want to work, put them in place to do that. If you're serious about it, you could do it. But I don't know what else other than that he would spend the money on. The whole point in having $5 million to commit to elections would be to make it easier for people to vote, to put a system in place to make voting more accessible. But he hadn't said anything that I've heard other than, being more open to online registration that would do that. But those are the kind of things we're going to suggest. That's going to be part of the legislation we're going to want to pass. And, the power that we have is that the Secretary of State has to come to us. I mean, he could say no just so often, but at some point he's going to have to keep coming back, and he can't keep telling us no. But the biggest part is that we have to be able to get everybody on board in the House of Representatives and in the Senate on these items and be able to be a solid, unified force to send that message to the Secretary of State and to the governor that this is what we want. And so, I mean, that's $5 million can go a long way in providing a safe election place and staffing a mail-in voting system that you could receive that kind of volume.
Absolutely. You're exactly right, because those are exactly the kinds of things that the money was passed to go towards. If you have to increase mail-in ballots, mail-in voting like we need to, it'll pay for that additional staff. It'll pay for it if we decide to have a really generous heart and mail people, give people postage on their applications, that sort of thing.
There you
It'll
go.
pay for that. Pay for all the expenses that we need just related to COVID. So it will pay for, sanitizing equipment if we have in-person early voting and we have additional stations or something like that. It will pay for so many things that will help us to be able to vote more safely. And also, it'll alleviate some of the feedback or the hesitation that you all get, because in the 2016 election reform panel report and earlier election reform panel reports, they talked about, we talked to the election commissioners, we talked to the circuit clerks, and we don't have money to expand early voting. Well, at least this year, we have $5.6 million more dollars.
That's right.
This is a great year for us to watch out for our safety. And for those of us who know we need expanded voting anyway, this is a great year for us to fight as hard as we can to make this happen.
Yes.
That's right.
Yep. And so I don't want to keep y'all too long, but I just want to close out by asking each panelist what we would like listeners to take away from this conversation, if there's one thing. And I'll answer my own question first and say, I would like everyone who's listening to know that you can get involved this year. Go to www.msdpvoterprotection.com. To sign up. We've got lots of different volunteer opportunities, so please get involved. It's super important this year. And then you guys take it away.
Ladies first.
I was gonna say we can let the representatives wrap it up. But one thing we didn't mention is a poll that came out in April where over 70% of Mississippians are concerned about the election, and it said 54% of people believe all Mississippians should be able to vote by mail this November. So this is a real concern. This is a real issue. This is a real shot for legislators on all sides to get on board to helping people vote safely and to really protecting the vote and expand the vote. And so we are so excited to be in this fight with Representative Summers and Representative Johnson and all our other Democratic elected officials. And we would just ask everybody watching to please connect with us, as Merritt said, so that we can support our legislators and we can all be able to vote safely in November.
Absolutely. Please get involved on your local level. Help us push for these measures that we're going to be advocating for at the state capitol. We're going to be on the front lines working really hard with our colleagues to get some of these things in place. And please just be prepared to vote. Know where your precinct is. Make sure that your registration status is active, because we need everybody to be able to turn out the vote in November in any measure that we finally come to. We just want you to be able to vote. And then also, I will be remiss if I didn't say, please, if you haven't already, go ahead and file with the census. Please report your numbers to the census. We have I believe, a 57% response rate right now in the state of Mississippi. And we have they've extended the deadline until October. So you have time to go online, vote, respond by mail or respond by phone for the census. So voting and then participating in that census.
That's excellent. The only thing I can add, and you all pretty thorough, but I would just say more acutely, as a representative and a member of the legislature, if you really want to see these changes made, contact your representative. Let them know how you feel about it, that you expect them to make voting more accessible, that you expect them to support mail-in voting and to have vote early, ways that will make voting more convenient and make it safer for you. And don't just call your representative or a Democratic representative. Call a Republican representative. They don't know. They just know that you're calling, you live in that area, and you care. They need to know that there is a public response, that people want these things to happen, so that they, a lot of things happen at the legislature. People do, they do it, sort of in the dark or sort of blindly, like nobody can see them. Let them know you're watching, and let them know that these are issues that are important to you, and you expect them to vote for them and support them. And I'm going to tell you, it makes a big difference. You'll see a change.
Absolutely. Well, with those final action items, I think we can let you guys go. But I really appreciate all of you guys being on the call tonight. And I'm ready to fight to protect the vote in Mississippi this year.
Absolutely. Thank you all for.
Thank you so much.
Great. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
Have a good weekend. Happy Memorial Day.
Day.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.